We're now going to talk about pivot table integration with EiB analytics. And I guess the first question is, well, why would you want to use pivot tables in the first place? And I think there's a number of reasons why. First of all, over the last few years, Microsoft have made some great strides in changing the way you can format pivot tables and the way you can package pivot tables with new functionality such as the slicers, in which you're seeing in the top left hand chart there, where I can just pick regions and products very interactively without leaving the core dashboard. Second thing is familiarization. Whilst we believe our EiB Report Studio add-in is a lot more powerful at producing formatted reports than pivot tables will ever be, there is some familiarity out there. People like pivot tables and people are used to using pivot tables. Now, obviously, normally there's a real big bad side of a pivot table in terms of you have to manage all the data collection and data processing. But of course here you don't, because by connecting the pivot tables to our cubes, then all the heavy lifting is done for you and all the data is not stored in the workbook, it's stored externally. So pivot tables become a much more viable and scalable option. And thirdly, the one thing we can't provide in Excel using our own Report Studio add-in is the ability to drill down into charts. The only object that allows you to do that in Excel is the pivot chart object, and we can utilize that in EiB Analytics. Now I can see an obvious question here, or hear an obvious question that says, okay, but if I look at the way, for example, you change criteria in pivot tables, then that look and feels very different from the way you change criteria in a la carte stroke EiB Analytics. So that would be very confusing, surely, to our end users, and I wouldn't disagree with that. But one of the things we've done in 2.18 is the ability to synchronize pivot tables with EiB reports. So for example, you could easily have a dummy or a real EiB Analytics report and have the dialogue from the criteria there driving the pivot table. So we eliminate this issue of having different ways of navigating one to the other, but we can also include some additional functionality such as the drill down on charts. So there's just a few reasons on why you'd want to consider this. So let me go over to a demonstration now. If I look in the menu here, we've got an option here. We've got some pivot tables that we've produced on top of EiB cubes. The first one here is on top of a sales cube. It was the actual pivot table that I showed a second ago in the PowerPoint. It's also using some geospatial analysis, which we can also add in here. So we're just using the Bing Maps add-in into Excel, and you can see if I pick a particular year here, you will see the colors actually change in size based on their values depending on the year we pick. So you can see those colors changing in the map. You can also see, obviously, depending on what we picked, whether we pick Europe, Middle East or whatever, you can see the actual values changing. And this is one of the things I do like in pivot tables, that if you package things like this, I don't even have to leave the dashboard to move between Middle East and Europe, or 2.16 and 2.18, and that I think is really, really nice. There is obviously a big but here, and the big but is, let's not confuse what might be nicely packaged versus what might be just pure demoware. This is great where we've got, in this case, 5 products, but what happens if you've got 1,000 products? How are you going to have this form of navigation? Well, quite honestly, you're not. And that's where you need the sort of integration with EiB Report Studio. But this is a nice thing, and I can obviously package this in quite a nice way with the reports and charts. And if I already know pivot tables, then I already know how to build these pivot tables and pivot charts. So that's quite nice. If I just come out of that and just go off-road, and you can obviously extrapolate that and produce some of the similar type charts as we produced in our own EiB dashboard. Here we're again looking at a sales cube and actually looking at top 10 products and bottom 10 products and so forth. So you can have obviously multiple pivot tables and pivot charts here that are being sourced here from underlying pivot tables. Okay, so all of that showing how we can introduce pivot tables to a cube. But then let's have a look at some of the other functionality that we can't perhaps do using our own report studio add-in, but we can when we use pivot tables. And I guess the obvious one here is the pivot chart functionality. So if I haven't integrated this report into a menu yet, I'm just going to produce a finance pivot table here, and this is on top of one of our Sage cubes. And I haven't done a particularly lovely job here at formatting this, but you get the idea. Let me just tidy this up a second, take off the grid lines, and maybe put this into full screen mode. So you can see here that I have got the finance cube dimensions here. So these are all lively accessing the cube. I can pick the year, I can pick cost center, department, company, all those good things. But one of the nice things I can do, which I can't do really using anything else, is you'll see here that we've got a breakdown of months down the bottom here. And what I can do is I can put drill path on those months. So if I go over to say April and I double click on April, that will actually drill me down now into the individual cost centers that make up April. So I'm now looking at the month of April, and I'm also looking at the cost centers. Now each cost center now is actually being broken down by their individual months as well, and I could now go to perhaps June in London and double click on that, and that would now actually show me a breakdown of the departments that are within London, and also show me their monthly breakdown. So in London's case, there is only one department called value added goods. Now I just can't do that in any other means. So that is quite a powerful feature on why you should link the EIB cubes through to pivot tables. Okay, but let's just look at another example of where things could get quite interesting. If I just go back to the gallery here, and I load a sales order pivot table. Now what I've done here is I have got one of our EIB analytics reports, and I've also got a pivot table in there, and I'm going to show you the reason why in a second. You'll see here that I've already preset this up, but I'll show you how I got there. That instead of using the pivot table field here for products, you'll see that that has actually been set to an EIB criteria slicer. So I can now actually pick an individual product here. Not a good choice there, there's no data there, but I can go back to all, and you'll see now that when I change what looks like an EIB control here, I'm effectively driving the pivot table. And I could do that in these other ones. I've only done one here, but I could replace product category and product status, because if you look at here, these are the pivot table ways of changing the criteria. A, they don't look as nice as the EIB ones. B, they're nowhere near as scalable. In fact, I think if you have more than 1,000 or 10,000, these don't even render, or they only show you the first 1,000. So again, we provide a lot more scalability and a better user experience by driving the pivot table through our own criteria. Now, how do you do that? To do that, you have to have one pivot table and at least one EIB report here. So you can see we've got an EIB report here, and one of the things we had in a la carte 2.15, but we've extended in EIB analytics, is you could always link together multiple a la carte stroke EIB reports. So if I had one report here and another report here, and I wanted to link the queries based on products, so as I change products in one, it changes in another, then I could do so in 2.15. In 2.18, that concept has been extended not to just link EIB reports to each other, but also link EIB reports to a pivot table. So the way you would actually do that here is if I go into the cube ribbon here and pick the linking, you'll see that slice linking now, instead of just taking you straight to which EIB reports do you want to do, you could link to an EIB report or to one or more pivot tables. And here I've just picked the pivot table. I've only got one here, but if you had multiple pivot tables in your workbook, you could decide that you want to link to each one of them, or just perhaps one that you want to drive the changes from. So that's some really nice new functionality we've introduced. It allows us again to provide new experiences to the user, such as drill down within charts within Excel, and it allows us, for people who have pivot table experience, to also embed pivot tables now as part of the EIB application. And of course you can then save those away to the gallery. And I'm going to use this example now to show you another feature, which is the multi-versioning of reports. And how do we do that? Well, let's take this one here. I've got a workbook that has got a mixture of an EiB report in it, and I've got a pivot table in it. If I want to save that to the gallery, if I do save to gallery, you'll see that by default, if I click on OK now or save, that is now going to overwrite my sales orders pivot table, and it's going to overwrite the existing version, which happens to be version 2. If I want to actually save that as version 3, then I click on the name in the gallery and actually then click on save as new version, and here you'll see it will auto generate 3, and it will also give a description saying, well, where did this thing come from? Well, it originated from V2, and I could put in here but made changes to X, Y, Z. And now when I click on OK, it saves that away, and if I close that pivot table and now go back to open that pivot table from the gallery, you'll see now that sales orders pivot table is at version 3. Now you could say, okay, well, that's alright, but what happens if I wanted to go back to V2? I don't really want to open that. I can right click on here and say launch, and actually launch V2 instead, or V1. So I can go back now and click on V2, and that would open that up for me. So actually, sorry, I need to go load alternate version V2, and that will now load up version 2 of the pivot table. So you can see there a lot easier way to save information and manage the gallery, and hopefully how we can combine pivot tables into the overall EiB offering.